This video is sponsored by Ridge. More on them later. You know what I've never done in over a decade of making videos on this channel? I've made lists ranking the best and worst from a series of games, and I've dabbled with tier lists more recently, but I've never taken the time to look over a franchise as a whole and work out how I feel about all the games one after another. A worst to best ranking, as it were, and hey, Metroid just had a new game release that is good enough to shake up my established ranking, so maybe we should work it all out together. So yeah, there's 14 Metroid games nowadays, not including the Metroid Prime trilogy because it's a compilation, and Metroid Prime 4 because it hasn't come out yet, and so I'm going to rank these 14 games from worst to best. I feel like I'm in a good position to pass judgment because I've played a lot of Metroid over the years, and I'm literally sitting pretty now that I've gotten rid of my old wallet. I used to own a chunky leather wallet that made it look like my Brazilian butt lift had gone horribly wrong, but one day I saw the light and was saved by Ridge, who were kind enough to sponsor today's video with their incredibly sturdy wallets that are available in more than 30 colors and can hold up to 12 cards that you can now carry around in your front pocket with a bit of style. Plus, Ridge were also kind enough to send me their waterproof commuter backpack with a shock-resistant laptop holder, and their larger Weekender duffel bag, which both have an external USB port for on-the-go charging, and when the world stops being on fire, I'm gonna be using these a lot. Ridge comes with a lifetime warranty, so you can buy one wallet for the rest of your life if you so wish, with a 45-day return window for a free refund if you're not such a fan. Get 10% off today with free worldwide shipping and returns by going to ridge.com/RabbidLuigi and using the code RabbidLuigi. It's time to move your wallet into the future. Anyway, let's do some ranking, let's go! I'm gonna keep this brief because I talked about this game last week, but for me, Other M comfortably props up the rankings table for Metroid games for being something that runs completely counter to what this franchise stands for. For the most part, I can see what they were doing, because after a trilogy of Prime games, it would have been dangerously boring to just retread those games, but the new additions are honestly a bit terrible. Focusing on Samus isn't such a bad idea, but she gets way too many monologues and too few moments that showcase her talents as a bounty hunter and her qualities as a character. This shift in focus is also why the camera's been pulled back to a third-person perspective so you can see more of Samus. But I never liked this because it feels like the devs were de-emphasizing exploration in favor of flashy combat that ends up feeling shallow and too much like style over substance. I don't hate that Other M tried new things, but I do hate where it left the franchise afterwards, a situation that every Metroid game after this has done something to undo. Have I said enough, or do I need Adam to grant me permission to move on? Yes, I have objections. With Metroid being a franchise with such a strong focus on single-player adventures, you'd be forgiven for thinking that Metroid Prime Hunters would be remembered as a decent DS game with mediocre multiplayer tacked on as an afterthought, but holy shit! Is this game skewed so far in the other direction? Story mode is plagued by repetitive areas and reused boss fights that aren't helped by a crampy control scheme and the overwhelming feeling that the DS wasn't quite ready for a 3D Metroid game. But as soon as you jump on over to the online multiplayer, it's like a whole new game. Short bursts of combat-centric gameplay where players can choose from 7 different hunters, including Samus, who all play differently, and Trace has a sniper rifle that kicks so much ass. It's a lot harder to play this game online than it was back in the mid-2000s, but it's the way to go with Hunters. Sadly, it's not enough of the overall package to help its ranking out all that much, so 13th it is. Bring back Trace, you cowards! I'd love to know how many people out there would put Federation Force at the bottom of their rankings, and also how many of those have played it with friends. I know it came out at a bad time and didn't appease fans who wanted something more, but with hindsight, this ain't such a bad game despite all the backlash. It's like a more well-rounded version of Hunters, but with multiplayer better woven into its main campaign, although at the cost of not quite reaching the same level as Hunters' multiplayer. Playing through the story with friends is honestly really fun, and if you can find 3 other people with nothing better to do than to play a Metroid game, not that Metroid game, then I implore you to give it a go. You might be pleasantly surprised just how much content there is in this much maligned Metroid game. Also, give Triforce Heroes a go, it's basically the same deal. Hey, did you know that Metroid had a spin-off pinball game? Yeah, I don't know. The guy behind the Prime trilogy enlisted the help of the people behind that Mario Pinball game because he remembered that Samus becomes a ball sometimes, and then, yeah, Metroid Prime Pinball. Is it any good? Yeah, it's not bad. It's pinball, but with a Metroid-y twist that does a surprisingly decent job at adapting pinball for this intergalactic setting. Samus being a pinball isn't as strange a concept as it sounds, and before long you forget that you're even playing a Metroid game as you settle down and just enjoy some pinball. Except pinball isn't all that deep most of the time, and so this game ends up feeling like something that you'll really enjoy for maybe an hour for the novelty, and then seek out a more robust experience instead. I can't criticize it too harshly because it's good at what it does, but it needed more variety than you'd expect from pinball. Hey, this came out in the middle of the Prime trilogy. I guess you could say that Samus was on a roll. I have some patience for Metroid 1. This game can get away with a lot these days, since it's like asking your 90-year-old granddad to play badminton with you when you're just happy that he can still walk with a cane. Metroid 1 is rough around the edges and feels archaic in a lot of places, but it was 35 years ago, for fuck's sake! If anything, it's a good thing that Metroid has moved on since these days as an indicator of the improvements made over the decades, and that this video likely wouldn't exist if this was what peak Metroid looked like. I have to be fair though, and say that I don't seek this game out to play very often because I know there's better examples of this formula, and there's even a vastly superior remake out there too. When Samus is capable of jumping and rolling all over the place, Metroid 1 just feels old, and that is not something you can say for every other debut of Nintendo IPs. Damn though, it deserves some credit for its twist ending. A woman in my Nintendo game? Give it time, Kotaku will still say she should smile more. I've really warmed to Metroid 2 over the years. There would have been a time when I would have put this below the original and maybe even the fucking pinball game, but nowadays I'm able to appreciate what this game was able to do at a time when there wasn't much to work with hardware-wise and Metroid-wise. It's a really blunt sequel. After Samus' first mission where she blows up the space pirates, the second game decides that the next natural course of action is to blow up all of the Metroids, and so you work your way through SR-338, killing nearly everything that moves and eradicating Metroids until they come back later. It's simple, but very easy to understand, and it allows Metroid 2 to flourish despite the hardware limitations. It's not quite as expansive as other Metroids, and you'll be hard-pressed to find too much optional stuff to do, but it's an early 90s Game Boy game. You can cut it a bit of slack. Still love the ending. You'd never get a Metroid game this quiet again. Shit's gotta blow up, you know? I feel like there's a pretty massive gap between this game and the last one, because we're starting off the top half of this ranking with Metroid Prime 3, which I would describe as way better than Metroid 2. You can feel Retro Studios plucking from a diminishing pool of ideas, but there's still a lot to like in the third Prime game, with the Federation having more of the spotlight, and Phazon being used to pit Samus against fellow bounty hunters and power Samus up herself. It's the usual 3D Metroid formula followed to a T, and everything is mostly as good as it was in Metroid Prime 1 and 2, but the new Hyper Mode feature, while fun to use and an inventive use of Phazon, has a habit of making the game a bit too easy in a lot of places. You know, these games aren't too hard and combat is already more of an inconvenience than a persistent challenge, but turning on the blue lasers is too much for the majority of enemies you come across. Still though, there's a good dynamic going on with Dark Samus, and by this point, Retro have nailed the feel of 3D Metroid, with so many of these environments feeling organic and lived in. Still though, I don't think there's ever been an easier Metroid game. Who made the third game in a trilogy the best starting point for new players? It wasn't all doom and gloom in the years leading up to Metroid Dread, like a hostile hike through a windy desert, because 2017 brought the surprise revival of Metroid 2 in the form of its remake, Metroid Samus Returns. The mid-2010s were a barren era for Metroid, so at the time this was like a water fountain in that desert, providing the public with a much-needed burst of 2D Metroid, something we hadn't seen in 13 years. What do I remember from it now I've had time to mull it over? Well, I had a melee counter that felt a bit overused in every enemy encounter, and I've already said how much I don't like the ending earlier this month, but other than that, it's a faithful but determined remake that isn't afraid of changing things up in service of being a better game. It feels very different in places, trading up the isolation of the original for more of a bombastic Metroid adventure, but nothing is lost without replacing it with something as good, if not better. Shame you had to shut down fan projects to get here, but, you know, omelets. The easiest way to describe Metroid Prime 2 Echoes is that it's the sequel it needed to be. Obviously it takes a lot of cues from the first game because, as we'll soon find out, it was pretty good, but I appreciate that Echoes was willing to shake things up to keep it fresh and exciting. Prime 2 is known primarily for having parallel dark and light worlds, which is a mechanic that basically the whole game is built around, and while I know a few people don't like this idea, I really like how it adds an extra, much needed layer of challenge, since the dark world constantly drains your health and has you hunting for safe zones. It's hardly a perfect sequel since its multiplayer is very superfluous, but I can appreciate that Echoes made a bunch of small changes that leave it feeling different to Prime 1, and most of them land with me. Even if not all of its bosses are worth the time, but hey, you put Quadraxis in a game, and you can do what you like. Within reason, though. If you discount Other M, you're not likely to find a more polarizing Metroid game than Fusion, and even then, Other M is mostly skewed by people just being wrong. The reason why Fusion is polarizing mostly comes down to it being a very different flavor of Metroid game, with the expansive backtracking being traded out for more railroaded linearity in aid of one of the scariest atmospheres put into a GBA game. Being forced to go to certain places at certain times takes a lot of the impetus away from the player, which puts Fusion at odds with the Metroidvania purists, but I personally love how the trade-off is that this game can pace out its scares for maximum terror. SAX is a series highlight whose presence completely transforms Fusion into a thinly disguised horror game and helps bring Metroid closer to its inspiration of Alien, and I for one love the shit out of it. Hard and unforgiving in places for sure, but so worth it for the feeling of dread that invades every moment. No way, that was the other game. You can't be too hard on Metroid 1, and all the proof you need for that can be found in Metroid Zero Mission, a remake of the original NES game for the GBA and also some of the best Metroiding you could ever hope for. It's such a good way of doing a remake since the structure of the original is in place and it's very respectful of its roots, but it introduces all the fluid movement of subsequent Metroid games and the quality of life tweaks that come with them, like being able to speed boost and shine sparkle all over the place. It's the way a remake should be done, really, and that's before it adds new areas and bosses and a playable epilogue in Samus' Zero suit with ancient Chozo ruins to explore. There's virtually nothing bad I can say about it, and I'm now realizing that the top 5 games in this ranking could easily be top, and I wouldn't complain. The standard's high, let's see where we go next. It's really hard to judge where Metroid Dread goes, really hard. I'll need some time to mull it over and work out how I feel about the game a few years down the road, but for now, this is the return to form that this franchise so badly needed. Combat has never been better in any Metroid game to date, with less reliance on the melee counter and more reliance on learning enemy behaviour and bosses' attack patterns. It's one of the hardest Metroid games out there, not least because of the Emmy's AI being tuned enough to track you fairly relentlessly, and on my first playthrough these things killed me easily more than 50 times total. Being a Mercury Steam production means that it plays a lot like a better version of Samus Returns, and you can feel the restrictions being lifted on the devs as they embrace their own talents of Metroid and their amazing understanding of Samus as a character. She doesn't say much, but her body language screams of a seasoned bounty hunter with little time for bullshit and supreme confidence in her abilities. Damn, do Mercury Steam want to give Other M a whirl? There's probably a good game under there somewhere. For the life of me, I have no idea how Metroid Prime is so good. Converting the franchise from 2D to 3D was always likely to be challenging, but Retro Studios managed it while also changing the genre so that it's more of a first-person shooter, but the shooting is played down to allow the adventuring and exploration to take center stage, and somehow this is all done without losing the essence and history of the franchise. No, really, it's crazy how different Prime is when compared to the 2D games, but it's also really similar at the same time. What you do get with Prime is a level of immersion that previous games can't match now that you're behind the eyes of Samus and can see the world as she sees it, and fuck. I know this game is 2 decades old, but it is absolutely gorgeous in a lot of places. If Metroid Prime 4 is half this good, then we're eating well tonight, boys. And to think we were starving for so long. No one watching this will be wondering what's left because the upper reaches of this video was always likely to be a fight between Metroid Prime and Super Metroid, and I've always loved Super Metroid just that little bit more. Nostalgia has nothing to do with it, since it came out a year before I was born, and I played it sometime in 2011 or 2012, I think, but it's fairly apparent from only a little time playing Super Metroid that this is peak Metroid, or at least pretty damn close to it. It's such a confident game, as if the devs have worked out from Metroid 1 and 2 what works and what doesn't, with Super Metroid jamming every part of the game with an incredible level of understanding of what this genre should be like, and after only the third game of the franchise. I know I said that any of the top 5 could have been top, but that's because they're all really good in a couple of areas like combat or atmosphere. Super Metroid is excellent at everything and has aged so well 27 years later that I can't help but notice that no one out there is asking for a remake. Why'd you need one when the original still knocks it out of the park? So yeah, that's my ranking of every Metroid game. Do you agree? Do you have a different game on top? Let me know in a comment down below, and make sure to leave a like if you enjoyed the video, and subscribe for more in the future. There's also a video on screen now about the worst things that Metroid has ever done, and I want to thank my top supporters on Patreon, including Jerome Sankara, Christopher Robinson, and Sarah Malion. Thank you for watching, and I wish Other M was better.